Sometimes, when we have more than one Pulumi stack, we want there to be slight differences between how the different stacks are deployed, but we ideally don't want to hard code these differences into the actual program code. So a convenient way to do this is to represent those differences through the Pulumi configuration. For each stack in your project, you will also have a configuration file, like these here, pulumi.dev.yaml for my dev stack and pulumi.prod.yaml for my production stack. And inside these files, you can see the Pulumi configuration. So in this video, I'm going to show you how to set config values, and then I'm going to show you how you can retrieve those values in the code. I'm also going to talk a little bit about secrets management. The actual Pulumi program I'm going to use in this video is based on the last video, which covered stacks, but don't worry if you've not seen it, it's not really too important what the program actually does. What I'm going to do in this video is assume that we want to vary the name of this S3 bucket here in different stacks. You can see we've sort of already done that here because we get the stack name and append it to this constant string here. But actually, I've decided I want more flexibility than that, and I want to be able to set exactly what the bucket name is separately for each environment. And so this is a good example of something where we should use the Pulumi configuration to do this. The first thing to do before I even change the code is to add this entry into the config. And one of the nicer ways to do that is using the command line. So I'm going to run the command pulumi config set, and then the name of the configuration item. So I'm just going to call it bucket name, and then its value. So I'm currently on my prod stack. So I'm going to call this, let's call it CloudSpeak live environment bucket. Doesn't really matter what it is. I'm just making up an example. And when you run that, you'll find that it has updated your YAML file here. Now, you could also modify this YAML file by hand. That's totally fine as well. But we'll see later on that sometimes doing it via the command line can be a little bit easier. You can see, for one thing, that it's actually prepended it with the name of the project, which is something you'd have to remember to do if you did it manually. We'll talk a bit more about that later on. And so now I can update the program to fetch that config value and then use it in the bucket name. So the way to do that is to construct an instance of a class called config, and it lives in the Pulumi package, at least when you're in TypeScript. If you're doing it in other languages, the syntax might be slightly different. So I'm going to say config equals new pulumi.config. Now I can use this object to fetch config item values. So I'm going to create a const called, I'm just going to call it custom bucket name. And I'm going to say config dot, and the method I'm going to show you first is called require. And what you do is you just pass in the name, the key that is of the configuration item, and that is the value that we use down here when we set the value. And so now I can just pass this in as my bucket name instead. And if we do Pulumi up, we'll see in our outputs that the bucket successfully changed name. So that was for the prod stack, but just to illustrate a point, I want to show what happens if we were to update the dev stack instead. Now don't forget that we haven't actually specified what this config value is for dev yet, because the config values are always per stack, and we did it for the prod stack. And as you can see, we get an error saying that we are missing a required configuration variable bucket name. Now, the reason for that is that we use this require method here, and require will throw an exception at this point if the config item that you're requesting, bucket name, does not exist, which in this case, it didn't, not when we deployed the dev stack. So, of course, we could just put the config item into our dev stack, and sometimes that's exactly the behavior you want, because there are some config items that you want to be guaranteed that the developer has definitely got in their config. Sometimes, though, it might be the case that a config item is optional, and perhaps there's some kind of default behavior that should happen if they haven't provided it. So just to show an example, let's assume that's the case instead. We can't use require anymore because that will always throw an exception. So this is where instead we should use the get method. The get method works in exactly the same way, but it won't throw an exception. Instead, it will just return undefined if that config item hasn't been specified. So I don't want to end up with an empty bucket name. I think if we were to run this now, we would probably get an exception here because we're not allowed to pass in an empty bucket name, even though the type system is allowing it. I don't think it would actually be allowed at runtime. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give it a default. So let's say that it'll either be whatever's in the config, or if it's not, then we'll just call it CloudSpeak default bucket, for example. And now if we run this for dev, then as expected, the bucket name has changed to CloudSpeak default bucket because we didn't actually provide a bucket name in our configuration. If we now went ahead and provided a bucket name in the config and then update again, it would of course try to replace it with that name. Just a quick note about data types. You may have noticed from the VS Code IntelliSense that when I use the get method, you'll see that there are some other gets for various types. So these, of course, are the different types that you could put into your YAML. So, for example, you can see get boolean and get number, and that's because as well as a string like this, if you're familiar with YAML, you'll know that that is actually a string, despite the lack of quotes. You could also put a boolean, you could also put a number. And if you want to get those into your code, not as strings, but as their actual primitive types, then you can call those methods. So at its most basic, that's all the configuration really is. But I'm going to show you a couple of other concepts that are useful to know about. The first of them is namespaces. Sometimes it's convenient to group your configuration according to what aspect of your program it's dealing with. And so you can do this by namespacing your configuration items. There's actually already an example of this in the configuration because we already had this AWS region set. But the reason that it's got this colon syntax is because the AWS is actually the namespace for this configuration item, and its actual name is region. And we saw when we first created this config item that the same is true here. It does actually have a namespace, but if you don't explicitly supply one, it will just default to using the project name. When we fetched this value in the code, though, we didn't have to provide the namespace. And that's because the way you pass in the namespace is through the constructor of the config object. But we didn't have to do it for our example because we'd use the default namespace. And that's what calling the config constructor without any arguments will do. If we want to get a namespaced value, then we have to create a different config. So let's say we want to get the AWS config. I'm going to create a constant called AWS config. Doesn't matter what that bit's called. But what does matter is that I'm going to this time pass in a namespace name. It's AWS. And we'll find that that now allows us to fetch the region by saying AWS config.get region, for example. And so that means get the config item called region in the AWS namespace, i.e. region item in the AWS namespace. I'm going to show one more worked example of this. Let's say that we also want to configure our S3 bucket with a website domain, for example. And this is the kind of thing you often set through config because it often varies between stacks. I've decided that I'm going to keep all of my web configuration in a namespace called web, because in the future I might have lots of web-related configuration that I want to keep together. So in order to set that, I type Pulumi config set web : I'm going to call it domain, and then its value. That will have added a value into my configuration file with the namespace that we expected. And then in order to get that, this time I'm going to do it all on one line, assuming that maybe for now I don't have any other web config I get, but in the future I could refactor it. I'm going to say web require domain. But I'll get rid of that for now because I don't actually have that domain set up through AWS. The final thing I want to mention is secrets, which is quite a nice feature of Pulumi. Often we'll have values like secret keys and passwords that we somehow need to keep track of and have accessible in our stacks, but that are very sensitive and we must keep them secure. And Pulumi has a way to do that where it can store it in your configuration, but encrypted. So in order to have a simple working example, I'm going to change this bucket name configuration item to be encrypted. Probably that's not something you would usually want to encrypt, but it's a nice easy example to show. Just for clarity, I'm going to start by getting rid of the config item entirely so that I can set it again from scratch. So in order to create a secret configuration item, use the same syntax. But you also add the -- secret option. We can immediately see the difference in our config file. This time, we don't have the actual value of the bucket name. Instead, we've got this object called secure, and it's got this encrypted value instead. This will also affect the way the code looks in here, because instead of using the get method, I have to use get secret instead. If we hover over this method, we'll see that this doesn't actually return a string now, like it did before. It returns a Pulumi output object. Outputs are the subject of the next video, so I will be talking more about secrets then. But for now, it's worth knowing that the reason Pulumi does this is because it's going to propagate the fact that this thing is secret all the way through your program. I'll show an example in the next video, but essentially it means that it will try to prevent that secret from becoming exposed whenever possible. It doesn't matter that it's no longer a pure string though, because this parameter here is actually compatible with Pulumi outputs, and again that's something I'll be talking about in the next video. It's worth noting that the Pulumi secrets functionality depends on support from whatever backend you are using to store your Pulumi state. Now for me that's just the default Pulumi service, the one that Pulumi obviously recommend themselves, and that's one of the nice advantages of using this, is that the encryption key that's being used for this config is being stored on their server. That's what makes this nice and secure, so anyone getting hold of your source code won't have any idea of how they can decrypt this. A side effect of this, though, that is worth knowing is that the encryption keys are different for each stack. So that means what I can't do is take this here and think, I want to have the same value in dev, because this won't work because the encryption keys won't match. You'll see this, in fact, if I rerun the previous command where I set the secret value and run it on dev instead. You'll notice, let's just look at those last few characters, for example, you'll notice that the encrypted value is completely different, despite the fact that the plain text is identical. And seeing as I've just mentioned the Pulumi service, it's worth mentioning that, like many other things, you can see your configuration on the Pulumi service web interface. So for example, if I click on one of my stacks, I can see the configuration that was used here, which is quite a useful feature. So that was an overview of Pulumi configuration, and in the next video I'm going to talk about Pulumi outputs, which will also cover a bit more information about secrets.